So this talk is called Transforming Our Suffering, and we're in our theme at the moment, and the theme is called This Very Day, Waking Up in Everyday Life, and this talk is Transforming Our Suffering. So we're looking at a text called the 7-Point Mind Training, and it's from the Tibetan tradition, taught by Atisha around about 1,000 years ago. And the text kind of contains these really pithy, powerful teachings that we can apply in our everyday life. So there's these kind of short, pithy slogans, and we've got the cards that we can take away with us. And we can use these slogans in our practice to bring the Dharma directly into our everyday life as we're living it this very day. So this evening's slogan is called, train in taking and sending alternately, which might not mean much to you at the moment, but I'll talk through what that means as I go through the talk. Okay. So far in the series, we've been looking primarily at adversity in our lives. So we've been looking at dukkha or suffering. So dukkha is a state of suffering, and this is what we've been looking at. And dukkha is not necessarily when something's gone wrong. It's not only when things go wrong. It's not only when we're in what we think of as a bad situation, or it's not always just a result of adversity like that in life. We tend to think it is. So we tend to think that if everything went our way and we just had everything the way we wanted it and we had everything we wanted, then we wouldn't suffer. But really, it's not like that. So if we can kind of imagine this, we can know this. If we imagine like the best amazing holiday that we can think of, we still wouldn't be perfectly content and happy on that holiday. We would still be experiencing some dukkha created by our own mind. We might just get grumpy, we might get bored sometimes. We probably would be thinking about when the holiday is going to have to end, and that sort of gets us down a bit. So everything wouldn't be just completely fine. We wouldn't have no suffering at all, even if we had things the way we wanted. So we do know this. We know this. We know that dukkha actually is a fact of life. It runs through our experience. It's the Buddha's first noble truth, isn't it? There is dukkha. It's a fact of our unenlightened life as we live it. It's a fact of conditioned existence. There is dukkha to some extent right up to enlightenment. So what we need to do is we need to learn how to use that dukkha for benefit, for spiritual benefit. So we can practice in a way to use dukkha for learning and for transformation. We can use dukkha for spiritual growth. So there's two ways to approach working with dukkha. We can use it to cultivate wisdom, and we can use it to cultivate compassion broadly. So Satyajyoti talked a few weeks ago about the wisdom approach, practicing with dukkha by applying wisdom. So Satyajyoti talked about bringing adversity onto the path, changing the way that we see adversity and seeing it as an opportunity. So an opportunity for benefit. And then the week after, we had those beautiful short talks from Sangha members on how they'd done that in their lives. So this evening, we're going to look at the second way of practicing with dukkha, using dukkha to cultivate connection and compassion. So we're going to be looking at cultivating compassion in the face of our suffering. So using the experience of dukkha to cultivate connection and compassion. So using dukkha to connect with others, So Sangha, I'll just give us a quote by Sangha about metta and therefore about compassion. He says, "It's no mere flabby sentiment, it's the vigorous expression of an imaginative identification with other living beings." And that is connection, isn't it? So we can use dukkha to connect with other people, and it does take courage and it takes determination. It takes a really strong grounding in positive emotion and awareness. So last week, Sangha Gita talked about having a solid foundation. She talked about this, the motivation and inspiration that we can come to rely on when we're working with dukkha, when we're working with suffering. So that's really important. Okay, so this evening, developing compassion and connection in the face of suffering. Because when we experience dukkha, when we're suffering, it tends to cut us off from other people. When we're suffering, we can tend to feel isolated and we can feel alone because we tend to contract, we tend to close off, we sort of close in on ourselves. It's quite understandable that when we're suffering, our focus goes inward on ourselves and on our suffering. It's quite natural and understandable that we do this. But that state of separation, it's completely out of line with the deepest truth of interconnectedness that we've learned about through Buddhist practice. And so because it's out of line with reality, it's very, very painful to be in this disconnected state, and it really doesn't help. So it's unskillful, this separation, it's unskillful in the sense that it creates further suffering and it doesn't lead towards relief and it doesn't lead towards liberation. And if we have some awareness around it, we can feel this happening. So I know that sometimes when I'm meditating, if I'm doing the metta bhavana and feeling quite connected and cultivating metta, something might come into my mind and then there's upset and there's maybe fear or there's anger. And I can just feel it. I can just feel the metta shrinking down, and I can sort of feel like my whole being is kind of shrinking and closing. I kind of closing in on myself. You can kind of feel this quite more easily in meditation when everything's fairly slowed down. So we can practice, we can train our minds. This is the mind training tradition. We can train our minds, and we can do that in a way that turns this tendency around. So instead, we can use dukkha to cultivate connection with other people rather than separating us off from them. And we can train our minds and we can just learn to do this. So I'm going to tell a story that illustrates this very strongly. It's a story from the Buddha's life, from the Pali Canon. And it's the story of a young woman called Kisa Gotami. It's a really tragic, heart-wrenching story. So it describes the unbearable grief of a mother at the death of her young child. So it's really heart-wrenching. And when I first heard this story, actually, I did struggle with it a little bit, and I think it can be one of those teachings that can be a bit misunderstood. So if that happens for you, do talk to me about it after the talk, because it is quite a strong story, really. So Kisa Gotami, she's a young woman from a very poor family. Her name means skinny Gotami, because she's really poor. She was really poor and she was really thin. And it was hard, because of this, it was hard for her family to find a good marriage for her. But they eventually did, and she married a wealthy man. And she joined the family household of her husband, which was the tradition at the time. But she was afforded, within the family, she was afforded only the very lowest status, because she was a skinny, childless woman from a lowly background. And in those days, that meant that she was really seriously looked down upon. So she had no standing in her family, she had no standing in society. She was disrespected and she was scorned. And she really did have a desperately hard and lonely life at that time. However, after some time, she gave birth to a son. She had a lovely young boy, and that meant that she then had status and she had respect and she was cared for. And her life was much improved. She became much happier. She had a beloved son, and also she was treated really well and really decently by her family. But tragically, when her son was just a toddler, he fell ill and he died. And Kisa Gotami, she was grief-stricken. She was grief-stricken to the point of madness. So not only did she have this terrible grief, but also her family life was completely over. Her respect in her household was gone because she was no longer a mother to a son. There was no sympathy, there was no support for her. So Kisa Gautami was mad with grief, and she wouldn't let the family take her boy's body from her. So in desperation, she fled the household with the boy's body wrapped in a cloth. She couldn't accept that he was dead, and she wanted desperately to find a way to save him. So it's really hard to tell this story. So she carried her dead son on her hip, and she went round the village. She was overcome with madness and grief. She was just begging people to help her. So she was asking, please, could they give her some medicine for her son? She was asking. And of course, nobody could help her son. They saw that her son was dead and that she was out of her mind with grief. So they would say, your son is dead, no medicine will help him. But nobody could get through to her. She couldn't hear anybody. She couldn't hear anything that anybody was saying, and nobody could help her. But one elderly man, he said, just go to find the Buddha. The Buddha's nearby. Go and ask the Buddha for help. So she went to the Buddha. She found the Buddha. She laid her son at the feet of the Buddha, and she begged the Buddha, please help me. Please give me medicine for my son. So the Buddha said he would help her, and he asked her to bring him a mustard seed from a household where nobody had died. So she went all around the village houses, knocking on all the doors, asking for a mustard seed. And of course, people were willing to give her a mustard seed, no problem. But when she asked, has anyone ever died in this household? They said, oh yes, of course. Recently my husband's died. Or at the next house, yes, my beloved child has died. Or the next house, my wife's died. My baby, my mother, my father, my brother, they've all died. And so it went on. So the people of the village told Kisa Gautami of the deaths of their loved ones, and she heard their stories and she heard their grief. And she really heard it. And she gave up. So she went back and she took her the body of her son to the graveyard, and she let him go. And as she let him go, she held his hand and she said, it's not just a truth for one village or town, nor just a truth for a single family, but for every world settled by gods and men, this indeed is what is true, impermanence. And then Kisa Gautami went back to the Buddha and she said to him, the mustard seed has done its work. And then she went for refuge to the Buddha. She actually joined the Sangha of nuns, and it wasn't long before she reached full enlightenment, and Kisa Gautami was eventually fully liberated from suffering. So that's the story of Kisa Gautami. So she went through tremendous suffering, but through that suffering, she connected with the truth of the suffering of all beings, of everyone. Okay, so we can see from this story how dukkha can create connection with other people. So at first, Kisa Gautami's suffering, it just trapped her in this personal prison of near madness, unimaginable state of suffering, and nobody could get through to her. But she connected through that suffering to the truth of the suffering of other people, and she eventually saw that suffering was part of the experience of everyone, actually everyone, and she connected to this universality of suffering in life. So in that we can see that in our suffering we're not alone either, we're not alone. We can feel solidarity with other people in their experience of suffering, because when we suffer, it's not just us. It feels like it is. It might feel like it's just us, but we're not isolated in our suffering. We all suffer. It's an aspect of everyone's life. So maybe we can try to reflect that way when we're really experiencing suffering, when that's strong, because we can be definitely sure that there are many other people in the world somewhere suffering exactly the same way as we are right now. We can know that for sure. And maybe that can help with this sense of separation that tends to happen. And we saw also in Kisa Gautami's story, a way through to finding connection with others when we are suffering is to do with seeing impermanence, reflecting on impermanence. This is what she said when she let go of her son. She said that impermanence is true for us all. So why does seeing impermanence bring us into connection with others? Because it could just lead us into despair, really. But Kisa Gautami saw that it's true for us all. So we're all living in a world of impermanence, constant change. And for all of us, that causes us to suffer, because we all want to hold on to what we have, and we all want to hold on to what we love. Our loved ones, our health. We don't want our loved ones to die. We don't want to get ill. And we are actually all in the same boat. We all suffer because of the same thing. So when we reflect on this universality of impermanence, universality of suffering for us all, this can bring a sense of solidarity and connection and compassion for other people, a sense of compassion for all beings who suffer in the same way. We're all in the same boat. And taken to its highest level, impermanence is in itself connection, because the truth of impermanence on a really profound, on its highest level, means that there are no fixed and separate beings. That's just kind of like a nightmare that we sort of mistakenly live in. There is, in fact, only radical interconnection and love, but we don't always see that. But that is the truth of how things are. Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about my own personal experience of seeing something of connection through death on my own level. And I'm sure you've probably got your own stories as well, or your own stories of connecting through dukkha. Okay, so a few years ago, my mum died, and she was quite young, really. She was diagnosed with cancer at age 68, so she was quite young, and it was a really difficult time. Of course, I was really upset, and actually, in fact, I was mostly angry at the time. Because my mum herself, she'd had quite a difficult life. She wasn't very old. My children were still young. They loved her and they needed their grandma. My mum was suffering. She was really poorly. And I just did not want any of this to be happening. I just didn't want the world to be like that. And it just, to my mind, it just wasn't fair. You know, it was too soon and I was suffering a lot and I didn't want it. And I would walk, at that time, I would kind of like stomp about. I was just like walking around in wild places whenever I could. There sort of wasn't really anything else to do with it, sort of just walking. And there was an occasion when I was really desperately sad. And I stopped and I was standing by a flowing river and I was just crying and crying up to the sky, really desperate. And it must have been autumn, and the leaves were all falling down from the trees, and they were filling the whole surface of the river. And they were all just getting washed away downstream. And I suddenly thought, oh, they're dying too. The leaves are dying too. The leaves are dying, and they're all being washed away. And I realised everything is dying. Everyone's mum will die. Everyone, without exception, will lose their mother, one way or another. Everything and everyone, without exception. And something opened up. That sounds quite bleak, but it really wasn't. Something opened up and there was just love. There was peace and there was ease. And there was this kind of exquisite beauty and poignancy, like a real peace and connection. It was like the world was changed and the world was perfect. There was nothing wrong with what was happening. And I could see that all beings whatsoever will suffer just as I do. And I wasn't alone. I think that was the thing, like I wasn't alone. This was how it was in the world. This was how it was for human beings. So the pain hadn't gone. The pain hadn't changed at all. It was just as strong, but its meaning had changed somehow. And I wasn't fighting it with anger. I wasn't railing against the situation. There was intense pain, but no suffering at that moment. And I think that was the first time that I understood that there's a difference, there can be a difference between pain and suffering. And pain doesn't have to be suffering. There can be a sense of sort of truth and beauty to pain, a poignancy and a connection with all beings when we're in pain, and a connection to reality, to how things are. So it was only a fleeting moment, but I've never forgotten it. And I can connect with my mum very tangibly by just remembering that moment and that experience. So dukkha, through experiences of adversity and impermanence, even very strong experiences, it can create connection with others. But we do need to practice this. So we need to practice consciously with this, deliberately and consciously, to make sure it's moving us in a direction of connection rather than disconnection or despair. So we need to do this as a deliberate practice. So the 7-point mind training, which is this theme, has a deliberate practice to do this. It's a meditation to develop connection and compassion through suffering. And it can be done just in our everyday lives as we're living our lives. So in the text, the mind training text, the bit that we're going to be looking at, these are the lines that we're going to be looking at. Train in sending and taking alternately. Let them ride upon the breath. Begin the exchange with yourself. Train in sending and taking alternately. Let them ride upon the breath. Begin the exchange with yourself. So what does that mean? It's a description of the meditation practice called Tonglen, which is a Tibetan word meaning giving and taking. So it's a traditional meditation practice. It's kind of a combination of the metta bhavana, loving kindness practice, and the mindfulness of breathing meditations. And it's a practice to develop compassion by using the awareness of the breath. So in its essence, on the in-breath, one takes in suffering, and on the out-breath, one gives out relief from suffering or happiness. So on the in-breath, we take in suffering, and on the out-breath, we give out happiness. So that effectively reverses our tendency to avoid suffering and to grasp onto happiness and pleasure. So it's reversing our natural tendency. So we take in suffering and we give out happiness. And it can be a really powerful practice for developing compassion and connection, because it actually shifts the focus from ourself and it shifts that outwards to all beings. And at the same time, it cultivates love and connection and compassion for others. So I'll describe the practice, and in the full practice, there's different ways to do the meditation, but I'll just give us one idea here of how it could be done in the full practice. So first of all, it's really important we would resource ourselves before we start. So maybe we would do that by developing a sense of metta, or by connecting with our true refuge, connecting with our higher vision, connecting with our Shraddha, our confidence, perhaps connecting with an archetypal Buddha or Bodhisattva figure, or a mantra, or a sense of deep connection in the heart. So we resource ourselves and we develop positive emotion. So we're not doing the practice in a sense of our small, limited, separate self. We're not doing it that way, but we're doing it from a larger perspective. We're doing it with abundance, and we're doing it when we're well resourced. So then the taking in, on the in-breath, we take in suffering. And as it says in the slogan, we start the exchange with oneself. So we could start with ourself, our own suffering. Maybe we have some fear, maybe we feel we're stuck, and we breathe that in. We breathe in our own suffering and we take that in. And then the sending, the suffering is transformed in our heart, or it's transformed by the refuge or by the Buddha, and we send out or we give away whatever will benefit, whatever is needed, resources that are going to help. So happiness, pleasure, well-being, confidence, health, ease, we give that out. We give that out on the out-breath. And then we could expand the practice to include not just ourselves and our own suffering, but the specific suffering of someone that we know and someone that we love. So maybe someone who is ill, maybe someone who is dying, and we take in their suffering. and we breathe out what they need. And then we can expand the practice even further to include the suffering of all the people in the world who are suffering in that same way. So we do these stages, and we can do the stages using visualization. So when we take in the suffering, we imagine that we're breathing in hot, foul, black smoke. We're breathing that in, taking that in, and when we breathe out, we're breathing out what is needed. We can imagine breathing out bright, cool, white light. So we're breathing in black smoke and we're breathing out white light. And we do this, we develop a rhythm. So we do this as a rhythm. We're breathing in suffering and we're breathing out happiness or benefit. Breathing in the dark smoke, breathing out bright white light. And we do that for ourselves, our loved ones, and ultimately we do that for all beings. So that's Tonglen. It's quite a strong practice. But actually, just to go back to my experience of my mum dying, when I was sat with my mum as she was dying and as she died. I was at her bedside for a week. She wanted to die at home, and fortunately we managed that, and she did. And as she was dying over the last few days, I did this kind of breathing practice with her, breathing, not as a formal practice really, but it just sort of felt right and it felt very natural. So I was breathing with her, taking in her pain and suffering and breathing out and wishing well for her and giving her what she needed, kind of ease and release and letting go. And it was a real tangible sense of kind of love and connection on a sort of on a different level. I don't really know, but it definitely helped a lot. Okay, so the full practice as I've described it, it's a really strong practice, and it's not advisable to do this unless we're strongly grounded in positive emotion. It's really, really important to not do that. So we need to be resourced. We need to be in really good states, reliably good states of positive emotion. And very importantly, we need to be in good connection with spiritual friends. Otherwise, the practice could lead to feelings of kind of isolation, contamination, and overwhelm. So it really does come with a health warning. But I thought it's interesting to know what this practice is. However, we can definitely do this practice on a simple everyday version of it, where we become, when we're in a situation maybe of some suffering, we become aware of that, we become aware of our own dukkha, and we can just reflect, oh, other people are experiencing that too. Other people experience that. Somewhere in the world, someone is suffering exactly like this. And we can cultivate compassion for all of us, for everyone, rather than just for ourselves. So that can be a much simpler and quicker way of developing connection with other people. We can do that reflection. So we can do that simple version, and we can do it in everyday situations. So any situation where there's dukkha, so we can practice this taking and receiving, or simply reflecting that others also suffer the same way. And this is the mind training. So training the mind when there's an experience of dukkha, not to just close off, but to connect and to try to cultivate a compassionate response. So for example, just simple things like we might be waiting at the bus stop and we're cold and we're bored. And we can just reflect, well, other people are cold and bored as well. And all around the world, people are probably cold and people are probably bored. So we can just we can do that. And then it's not just us and we're not on our own. Yeah, so we can just reflect that other people suffer. And in the supermarket queue, maybe we might feel a bit ignored and we might feel frustrated, and everybody else in the queue feels bored, feels frustrated. So it's not just me. And maybe we can just breathe out some relief for them, take in their frustration, breathe out relief. And we can reflect that, yeah, they too wish they were already at home eating their tea. Not just me. It's not just me that wants my tea. So we can do it when we're nervous, we can do it when we're fearful, we can do it when we're angry or when we're sad, when we feel mean, when we feel irritated, when we're ill, when we feel poorly, or when we're tired. We can do the same thing. Take in suffering, give out happiness. Or alternately, we can reflect that someone else feels just like this, just now, and wish them well as myself. Wish them relief from suffering as well. So it's quite a simple everyday practice, but if we do it and we keep doing it, it trains the mind so that automatically then when there's suffering, we move out to other people and we connect, and it eases the suffering. Okay, so we've heard about dukkha, and we've heard how with practice we can use dukkha to connect with other people. We've heard about Kisa Gautami and how her experience of severe suffering led to connection with others and ultimately to her full liberation. We've learned how to practice to nurture this sense of connection and compassion through our own experience of dukkha, through reflecting on how others suffer too, and perhaps, if the conditions are right, through the practice of Tonglen. So it's really important to consciously practice with dukkha because it's quite natural and understandable to want to close off and want to disconnect and just protect ourselves when we're suffering. It's quite natural. So we do need to consciously practice with dukkha. So we need to train our minds to reverse that tendency, train our minds to ease our own suffering and the suffering of others through connection and through compassion. Okay, so we can take this as our slogan for the week, and there are some cards, I think, that people can take out. So the cards, training, sending and taking alternately, let them ride upon the breath, begin the exchange with yourself, and we remember that that means realising, not just the Tonglen practice, but realising that others suffer just as we do. So we take that in and connecting with others with compassion, sending that out. So that could be our homework, our practice for the week, maybe using our dukkha, transforming our dukkha and using it to connect with others and cultivate compassion. Okay, so that's the talk. And in the groups, we'll go into groups now, and in the groups, and then maybe for homework, if you want to do some homework this week, we could think and we could talk about where are some situations this coming week where I could use this practice of connection. Where can I use dukkha? So maybe that I can see that there'll be some dukkha in the week somewhere, a specific situation, and where can I use that to connect with others and to develop compassion?